Hey everyone, Noir here. Let's get into today's Reddit story.
My whole life changed while I was sitting on the classroom floor, grading spelling tests with a red marker. It was a Wednesday afternoon near the end of October. The room smelled of dry erase markers and the apple cinnamon candle my co-teacher always kept on her desk. 22 first graders sat at their tables quietly, working through handwriting worksheets. I was sitting cross-legged on the reading rug, with a pile of papers in my lap, when my phone vibrated inside my cardigan pocket. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it and let it go to voicemail, but for some reason I answered. A calm, polite man asked if I was Evelyn Grace Whitmore. I told him I was, even though nobody had used my full name since my grandmother used to say it whenever she pretended to scold me. Then he introduced himself as an attorney. He told me there had been a crash on Route 17 outside Knoxville. He said my grandparents, Walter and Helen Whitmore, had been killed. I remember staring at a little paper butterfly one of my students had taped to the leg of my desk. I looked at it for what felt like forever. After that, everything becomes a blur. Before I explain what happened next, you need to understand the family I grew up in. And I mean really understand it, because from the outside, we looked like the perfect family. I grew up in a suburb outside Nashville, Tennessee. My father, Richard, and my mother, Cynthia, cared more than anything about appearances. My father sold commercial real estate and drove the kind of car that showed people he was successful before he even got out. My mother ran the neighborhood beautification committee, organized fundraising luncheons, and always made sure our Christmas lights were hanging before anyone else's. I also had an older brother named Travis. He was 2 years older than me and exactly the son my parents had always wanted. He was confident, tall, and somehow always knew how to make my father laugh. By the age of 12, he was already playing golf. He could walk into any room and immediately fit in. I was different. I loved books, thunderstorms, and watching things grow. I asked too many questions about subjects my mother thought did not matter, and never enough about the ones she believed did. At family dinners, I usually faded into the background. The only place where I ever felt completely at peace was my grandparents' house in the foothills outside Knoxville. Walter and Helen had built Whitmore Logistics Group from the ground up. They started with absolutely nothing. My grandfather borrowed his first truck and drove freight between Knoxville and Charlotte, sleeping at rest stops because he could not afford motel rooms. He had only finished the 6th grade, but he had more integrity than anyone I have ever known. Their house was small, slightly crooked, and always smelled of coffee and wood smoke. My grandmother grew tomatoes behind the house, and my grandfather spent hours in his workshop, letting me hand him tools while he explained what each one was used for. My father was embarrassed by them. He called their neighborhood the Holler, even though that was never true. At family gatherings, he made quiet little remarks about the truck in their driveway or the way my grandmother clipped coupons. He never came right out and said they were beneath us, but that was always the message. He conveniently forgot that they had paid for the house we lived in. He forgot they had given him the money for the down payment on his first commercial real estate deal. Every time his business struggled, Walter and Helen quietly stepped in to help him. They never complained about it, and they never mentioned it to me. I spent every summer with them. My grandmother taught me how to make biscuits from scratch, sew a straight hem, and always look people in the eye while they were speaking. My grandfather taught me that a handshake from an honest person was worth more than any written contract. He also taught me that the hardest working people are usually the ones nobody notices, and that real leaders notice them first. When I told my parents I wanted to become a teacher, my mother slowly put down her fork before speaking. "Evelyn," she said, "you have other options." My father simply said, "We're not paying for that," and they never did. My grandparents paid for my education without a second thought. The week I started my education program, my grandmother mailed me a card. In her neat cursive handwriting, she wrote, "We are so proud of you. The world needs more people who show up for children. You are going to be wonderful." I carried that card in my wallet for years. I still have it today. Eventually, I became a first-grade teacher at a public school in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. My apartment was small, my car had rust around the wheel wells, and I ate a lot of pasta. Even so, I loved my life. My students meant everything to me. Whenever I had a hard day, I always remembered something my grandfather used to tell me. My grandfather always used to tell me, "Do your work like it matters, Evie girl, because it does." My parents called once in a while, but those conversations were almost never about me. They usually wanted to tell me about Travis's latest success, or remind me that another cousin was getting married and that I needed to buy something nice to wear. They never asked about my classroom. They never asked about my students. Every Sunday, I drove to Knoxville to have dinner with my grandparents. I did that for 9 straight years. Unless I was sick, I never missed a single Sunday. The funeral reflected the rest of my family perfectly. It looked polished on the outside, but it felt empty underneath. My mother wore an elegant hat. My father gave a eulogy that sounded more like a list of achievements than a tribute to the people they had lost. Travis stood in the receiving line, accepting condolences with the kind of rehearsed sadness that did not feel genuine. Relatives I had not seen in years filled the church, talking about what wonderful people Walter and Helen had been. It would have meant more if any of them had actually visited during the last 10 years. I stood near the back, crying quietly, and nobody seemed to notice. 2 weeks later, we were asked to meet with an attorney named Nathan Brooks. His office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Knoxville, overlooking the Tennessee River. Everything inside was quiet, clean, and polished. My father sat there looking like he already believed everything in that room belonged to him. My mother rested her hands in her lap, her nails painted a deep plum color. Travis had driven 2 hours to be there, but he kept glancing toward the door as if he expected someone more important to arrive. Nathan Brooks began reading the usual legal language. I barely listened. My attention stayed on a framed photograph hanging on the wall, showing the river in the early morning with fog drifting across the water. I was doing everything I could to keep myself together. Then Nathan said, "The entirety of the estate, including all shares of Whitmore Logistics Group, the property at 5836 Meadow Creek Lane, and all liquid and investment accounts with an estimated value of $31 million, is bequeathed to one person." The entire room seemed to freeze. Evelyn Grace Whitmore is the sole beneficiary. The silence afterward was louder than any shouting I have ever heard. Over the next few seconds, my father's expression changed from disbelief to confusion and then to pure anger. "Read that again," he said, speaking in a voice that was almost too calm. Nathan did not read it again. Instead, he quietly slid the document across the desk. My mother was the first to lose her composure. "This has to be some kind of joke," she snapped. They were old. She was over there every Sunday filling their heads with— Nathan interrupted her calmly. They expected questions about their mental capacity. Then he turned his laptop around. They recorded a message. The screen lit up, and there were my grandparents sitting together on the old couch with the faded blue floral pattern, the same couch where I had spent countless afternoons growing up. They looked older than I remembered, but their eyes were bright, focused, and completely clear. My grandfather spoke first. "Well, if you're watching this, then we're gone. I just hope we didn't leave too much of a mess behind." He smiled. "Helen picked out what we were going to wear, so at least the caskets should look tasteful." My grandmother laughed softly and nudged him with her elbow. Even in that moment, they still managed to make me smile through my tears. "We made this decision with clear minds and full hearts," my grandmother said, looking directly into the camera. "We spent a long time thinking about what a legacy really means. It isn't money, it's values. It's what you leave behind and the people who carry those values forward." My grandfather cleared his throat. "Richard and Cynthia, we love you. You're our children. But loving someone and trusting someone are not the same thing. And over the years, we learned the difference. We watched how you treated this family. We watched how you handled this money. We watched the way you treated people who could do nothing for you. We saw you." Then my grandmother looked straight into the camera again, and we saw Evelyn. She came to see us every Sunday for 9 years. She sat with us. She never asked us for anything. She laughed at your grandfather's awful jokes, helped me in the garden, and sometimes called just because she wanted to hear our voices. She is the keeper of this family's heart, and that is why she will become the keeper of everything we built. The screen went black. I will not describe everything that happened in that office after the video ended. I'll only say this: It did not end quickly, and it was anything but quiet. My father shouted words I refused to repeat. My mother cried, but those tears had nothing to do with losing her parents. Travis looked at me with a level of hatred that was almost shocking in its clarity. That evening, my parents told me to come to their house. I went because part of me still hoped there was something left to save. There wasn't. My father already had legal paperwork waiting for me. It transferred administrative control of the estate to them. According to him, they would be the ones managing everything. According to my father, I would receive what he called a generous allocation of 15%. "You're a first-grade teacher," my mother said, as though that alone proved I was unqualified. "You can't run a multi-million-dollar company. This is the responsible decision, Evelyn. We're trying to protect you." I looked down at the papers on the coffee table. Then I remembered my grandmother's words from the video. "She is the keeper of this family's heart." "No," I said. That was all it took. Travis slammed one of the kitchen cabinets. My father raised his voice and told me that if I walked out without signing those papers, I would never be part of the family again. No holidays, no phone calls, nothing. As far as they were concerned, I would be dead. I walked out anyway. Less than an hour later, I found out my father secretly owned the apartment building where I lived. It had always been held through a shell company called Crestview Property Holdings Limited Liability Company. I had never known. A text message arrived with a formal eviction notice. I had until midnight to leave. I packed everything that mattered, my clothes, my books, every letter my grandparents had ever written to me, the quilt my grandmother made when I left for college, stitched together from pieces of her old house dresses, my grandfather's worn flannel shirts, and even a square cut from my childhood Halloween costume. As I carried my last box outside, my father was standing on the sidewalk waiting for me. He looked me in the eye and told me I had been an accident. He said they had been happier before I was born. Then he told me I had done nothing except make his life harder. I got into my car and drove straight to Knoxville. The next morning, Nathan Brooks was waiting on my grandparents' front porch with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of biscuits from the local bakery. He told me he had spent the whole night trying to reach me. When I never answered, he figured I had gone to the one place that still felt like home. We sat together at the kitchen table, and he showed me everything my grandparents had spent the last 4 years preparing. First came one folder, then another. My grandmother had kept detailed journals. Inside were records of every loan my father had borrowed and never repaid. She had written down every time he called them fools behind their backs. She even documented every occasion my aunt claimed she had no money while posting vacation pictures all over Facebook. Nathan also showed me copies of a $240,000 loan my grandfather had co-signed for my father 5 years earlier. It had never been repaid, and my father had kept it hidden from his own business partners. Then Nathan opened his laptop. Security camera footage appeared on the screen. Just 2 days after the funeral, my parents had used a spare key to let themselves into the house. My mother walked straight to the hallway bookshelf, pulled out the false back panel, and opened the small fireproof lockbox hidden behind it. She removed my grandmother's pearl earrings, the garnet brooch she wore every Christmas, and the gold locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. My father never touched anything. He simply stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching. My grandparents had installed that security system because they feared something exactly like this might happen. They had prepared for everything. There were medical evaluations confirming they were fully competent, all signed within 6 months before they passed away. There were sworn statements from their pastor, their doctor, and even the neighbor who had lived beside them for 31 years. They had built an airtight case. Then they handed it to me. Over the next several days, the people my grandparents trusted began arriving one by one. Martha, my grandmother's closest friend for 40 years, brought another journal along with enough casserole to feed half the county. Raymond, who had worked in my grandfather's garage for 22 years, told us about hearing my father yelling over the phone one afternoon, calling my grandfather a stingy old man who just needed to die. Victor, my grandfather's longtime business partner, quietly spread years of financial records across the kitchen table. Then Judge Diane Holloway arrived. She had grown up just down the road from my grandparents. Wearing a blazer, she walked inside and simply said, "Walter once called in every favor I owed him. It's time for me to return one. The following morning, my father, mother, and Travis came to the house expecting to find me alone. Instead, they found a room full of people: a retired judge, a former county sheriff's deputy who had become my grandparents' friend and neighbor, their longtime business partner with stacks of financial records neatly arranged across the table. My father launched into his usual performance. He pointed at me and called me manipulative. He accused everyone of turning the situation into a circus. Nathan let him finish, then he pressed play. The security footage filled the screen. My parents watched themselves enter the house. My mother froze. Without saying a word, Victor placed the loan documents on the coffee table. The room fell silent. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone already knows the truth. I looked at my father, and for the first time in my life, I saw him for who he really was. Not the man I had spent 30 years trying to impress. Just a scared, greedy man who had never stopped to ask himself what kind of person he had become. "You didn't come here because you wanted to protect me," I said. "You came because you were afraid I might become someone you couldn't control. You spent my entire life making me feel like I would never measure up. But the two people who knew me better than anyone else, the two people who watched this family for 50 years, chose me. That has to mean something, even if you never admit it." My father had nothing to say. My mother cried, and for the first time, it seemed those tears might actually be genuine. Then they left. The front door closed behind them, and it felt like everyone in the room could finally breathe again. The months that followed kept me busy. Nathan walked me through every step of the legal process, with patience and care. Victor taught me how the logistics company worked from the ground up. He was fully capable of running the business himself. But my grandfather had always believed that a leader should understand the work of the people they lead before expecting their respect. I learned how a trucking fleet operates. I learned what it costs drivers to spend days away from their families. I learned why my grandfather always kept fresh coffee brewing in his office, and why his door was never closed to anyone. While going through my grandparents' files, I found plans they had quietly been working on for the past 2 years. It was the beginning of a charitable foundation. They called it the Walter and Helen Whitmore Community Fund. Their vision was simple. They wanted to provide scholarships for first-generation college students from rural East Tennessee, help teachers buy supplies for underfunded classrooms, and support after-school arts programs with dedicated grants. During the first year, I contributed $8 million to make that vision a reality. I also stayed exactly where I wanted to be. I kept teaching. Every morning, I still walked into my classroom to greet 22 first graders who were learning how to read, how to share, and how to discover that school could be a place where they felt welcome. The money changed what I was able to do for my students, but it never changed why I became a teacher. If a child came to school wearing shoes with holes in the toes, I could help. If a student had an incredible talent for music, but their family could not afford lessons, I could help with that too. I never looked at the money as something I was supposed to keep. I saw it as something I was supposed to use. These days, I live in my grandparents' house. It still carries the familiar smell of coffee and wood smoke. Every summer, the tomato plants grow back. My grandfather's tools are still lined up by size in his workshop, exactly where he left them. I have not moved a single one. Every Sunday, the kitchen table fills up again. Martha comes, Raymond comes, Victor and his wife come, Nathan comes too. Somewhere along the way, he became almost like the uncle I never had. Teachers from my school stop by. Neighbors come over. It is a loud, messy, imperfect group of people who all loved the same two people I loved. And after they were gone, they chose to keep showing up for one another. Those Sunday dinners are nothing like the ones I grew up with. Nobody is pretending. Nobody is keeping score. We laugh too loudly, argue over Tennessee football, eat far too much, and stay around the table long after the meal is over. That is what my grandparents really left me, not $31 million. They left me proof that a life built on honesty and integrity keeps growing long after you're gone. Every fair deal my grandfather made, every employee he treated with respect, every neighbor he helped without expecting anything in return eventually found its way back. Not to him. He never needed anything in return. It came back to me through a room full of people who loved him enough to stand beside me when it mattered. my grandparents also taught me that real wealth is never measured by what you collect. It is measured by what you build in other people. It is a classroom that never runs out of crayons. It is a student from a small town getting the chance to attend college because someone they never met believed they deserved that opportunity. It is a Sunday dinner where nobody has to prove they belong before taking a seat at the table. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, if you've ever lived in a house where you constantly felt like an afterthought, I want you to remember this. The people who truly see you do exist. Sometimes they are not the people you expected. Sometimes they are the people everyone else overlooks. And sometimes the people who are supposed to love you reveal exactly who they are. When that happens, one of the strongest things you can do is believe them. Do not spend your life trying to earn the approval of people who decided long ago they would never give it. Instead, find the people who keep showing up every Sunday.